Assalamu alaikum. NTV ballomgen dawahuri habe fuluna marhaba. Alugada zaruna mi hafta vesmi baddala kolli hasahiyen ehiye me program ge mulinga program hushala denuma. Alugada kiga mere studio ga me nevi Shueka adi Lisa. Warabada marhaba de be fuluna sigeta. Merega maudu hasakure famennani oral facial myofunctional disorder nuat agag masaltaka behegotu. First of all, what is oral facial myofunctional disorders and oral motor deficits, and what is the difference between them?
It's a good question. So it can be really confusing because the names are kind of similar and they're really long. Yeah. But essentially, oral myofunctional disorders are patterns of abnormal muscle function of the face, the lips, the tongue, your jaw. They can affect the posture at rest. It can affect swallowing, chewing, breathing, and speech. So, and then oral motor deficits are more just like your strength or coordination or sensory problems that kind of underlie these patterns that develop. And both of these issues, they're multifactorial and they're treated by a broad team. So just to clarify a little bit more, so an oral motor deficit, that's impairment in strength, coordination, range of motion, and endurance of the oral structures. So they're often like neurological or developmental. So there are disorders called like dysarthria that people can be born with or they can acquire through like a stroke or something. But basically what that looks like is like your muscles are just weak. You know, you try to lift your tongue and move it and it's just too weak to move, things like that. Or there are disorders like apraxia, which again, children can be born with, or you can acquire through a head injury or stroke, where your brain tells your mouth, move this way, and your mouth does something different. It kind of short wires on the way there. So essentially the oral motor components are where your face is not able to do the things it needs to do to specifically like eat, drink, speak. And so then we start to develop the oral myofunctional disorders, which are they're symptoms that come from that impairment. So they're essentially the oral myofunctional disorders are the compensations and patterns that your body takes on to kind of accommodate for the weakness. So some of the big key differences, so oral myofunctional disorders are usually habitual and behavioral, so they're the compensation. So it might look like things, it's going to affect the way you breathe. Instead of breathing just out of your nose, you might do a lot of mouth breathing. It could affect your swallowing pattern. So instead of, if this is the roof of your mouth and this is your tongue, instead of closing your mouth and your tongue doing a wave off your palate to swallow the food, you might keep your mouth open and push your tongue forward and just pump the food back and forth like that. We see that a lot in children with Down syndrome, for example. Anyway, so these disorders, they're very related and there's a lot of overlap. And if you see signs of the oral motor disorders when kids are babies or young toddlers, a lot of times it's oral myofunctional disorders. So like essentially like the impairment is going to lead to compensation. So this doesn't work right, we're going to get compensatory patterns. So basically oral motor deficits are the cause, and then the oral myofunctional disorders are the symptoms.
Me Lisa vidalu hemme har miyedege me topic ke me hasa kolli angage masal takadetto me har anga me je de mara muhimu penu me pove me angage me dannevi hammuli moonuge me huri habata me har moonu feshigen gos ine me embe furata misaka adu fede ni zamun as den alugon mege me adang ebe edwe detto notion ero resonatory system e hisabun articulatory system e uriha articulatory ge mane ki akurtak ki apni hunwara bavar bata ke bohore agag misal ka dula kola tumfata madutali harutali ekhala e huriha bata ku ka bidi mawa masata nge to demara am ko fene mihar ku dinge wargina fennane akurtak ki umuga pakata kar waran hadi ko den mi gengulen jehe gota kala agage mastanu gengulevi den kairuga waraboda fahaga wane saka hafago tafatu ve dane ekahala mi honne ki kahala huriha masata ke ebe kuleve mi agage mi honna masata ka den e vidalu hen mi aro mi oral mota e bunani e agage mi honna masala inge to misal ka ekama ki eve dane e mastakuge baru hunnan jehe warane tikama nuniya mi komis kala aben horige kala komis sababa ka hore e haraka kuran je waran haraka nu koreven ege sababu misaka kamen hurima den eti compensate kuran eba jehada to komis kotka misalaka kairuga misaka kolum nu hefenya den hafani komis ehen goten hodane em wargina bai kudin fednane mi aga nu hefe tive kuriya kaisi genesken mi kodko bomun ekahala gotaka kaichi diruwani hafan nu hefe tive noniya misal kan akurta kiyaru gaves du e harka kuran je gota misal nu hilleni den hem veja hen gotaka jasaf kiyane hebe mi hadiwani ehme ma e asluga emme furatama masalen hurima ege sab emi ege ekam ge sababun mi itur goten hodam wegen demiannani oro mayo functional le inge to ehme ma e mahuri ha masal tan ebe himene egaten niti savidalo hem team maseke me korani misaka team ge tereng e bayaki alu government speech therapist so there are other members also right occupational therapist service maram ga ko maseke korani hammi uri ha mastaka mai maseke korumuga den nirege hemma mi topic waraboda wagate kegen dane
just give a brief explanation about orofacial malfunctional disorder. What causes these disorders?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So for both of these, like with the oral motor deficits, like since that's like the underlying cause, usually we'll start there. So some things you'll see some birth. So like some of those neurological conditions like cerebral palsy, stroke, brain injury, or you can have some developmental disorders such as like Down syndrome and autism. Most children with Down syndrome are born with low tone, and then like over half of children with autism spectrum disorder also have low tone. And so you'll see a lot of weakness and fine motor problems. It'll usually probably come out like in their hands and things first as they're developing, but it also is affecting their feeding and their speech. You'll see it in muscular disorders such as muscular dystrophy. And so these compensations for feeding and speech, like if we're really going to break down what's going wrong. So there's 3 terms I want to talk about: poor dissociation, grading, and fixing. So dissociation is a lot of time that's a term that like occupational and physical therapists use, but it also applies to our mouths and what happens with feeding and eating and breathing, all those things. So dissociation is the separation of movement based on having adequate strength and stability of 2 or more muscle groups. So my example would be like I can dissociate my arm from my chest, right? So my arm can go and pick up this coffee cup, right? But there's a little bit more fine tuning to that. So dissociation is like a big movement. Like I can just separate these 2 body parts and I have the strength and stability to do it. So I can get to the cup, right? But to get the cup to me, I need grading. So grading is the controlled segmentation of movement. That it starts with the dissociation and that strength and stability, but it's a more refined skill than dissociation. So not only do I need to just be able to separate my arm from my body to get to the cup, I also need to be able to bend my elbow here, 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 and then my hand to get it into my mouth. So if we think about like what that looks like in our face, right? The three big groups that we need to be able to dissociate: our jaw, our lips, and our tongue. And when babies are born, all of those things are kind of working together as one unit. If the jaw moves, the tongue and the mouth, the lips, it's all going together. So what this might look like, if somebody does not have dissociation, what that's going to look like, or what I see in my practice most often, the easiest telltale sign, I'll go to put food in the side of their mouth over here, and what should happen is their tongue should just go sideways to get the food, but what instead happens is their whole head turns. Whenever they try to turn their tongue, the whole head goes with it. So they can't separate their tongue from their jaw. They're moving almost as one, or maybe they can do it a little bit, but there's not very much. It's not complete dissociation. This can also happen like a lot of children feeding, and they rely on mom or dad, like when mom and dad have the spoon, they're relying on mom and dad to scrape the top of the spoon off their teeth, which, okay, when kids first start learning to eat, that's normal, but what they should learn to do is, instead of relying on mom and dad to do that, they're learning to separate their lips from their jaw and use their lips to go extract. And again, that's also a problem with speech a lot of times. Like if you think about like all the different directions, our lips and our tongue need to be able to move independently to make all of the speech sounds. So, and that is what's going to bring in our last term of fixing. So, fixing is a compensation. Like if you don't have good dissociation or grating in your mouth, you're going to get fixing. So, let me back up. So grating in the mouth, so the dissociation is moving all the parts, right? And the grating is being able to do it steadily for the full range of motion. So the jaw can move up and down, and we're stable the whole time. The jaw can be at whatever height, and I can move my tongue. I can move my tongue without moving my jaw at every angle. For some kids, they can stick their tongue out, but the second they start trying to like grade and do like those more precise movements with their tongue, their jaw starts going with it, so they lose their stability. So it's like, kind of like that. So when children do not have, or adults honestly, so if you don't have good dissociation, you can't move your body parts, and you don't have a lot of control as you're trying to move them up and down, they do this compensatory strategy called fixing, which is an abnormal movement pattern that occurs secondary to that reduced stability like we talked about, and it's used to compensate for the lack of grating within a muscle group. So fixing inhibits the mobility. So an example of this, just like a real life example, is like if you have somebody that's an experienced skater and they're all of a sudden like somebody falls in front of them, they can stop, they can shift their whole body weight and swerve and go around the object. But if you have like a new skater, like my 4-year-old, if something falls in front of him, he's just going to brace for impact. Everything's going to get tight, and he's just going to hold on for dear life and hit the object because he doesn't have the skills to go around. So what this looks like in our mouths a lot of times, specifically with speaking, you might see people or children that instead of like, their mouth moving like mine is right now, they might kind of lock their teeth together like this. And a lot of times, like in the Talk Tools oral placement therapy, they'll talk about the smiling kid, like, which was just a case study that was done by one of our therapists there. But there was this child that they were like, this kid is so happy, he's always smiling. But then she realized he was talking like this because he couldn't control his jaw movements. And so he had to lock his teeth together because that was the only way he could control his tongue and lip movement. So he was fixing. So fixing is basically like he's finding his own stability. So he locked his teeth together, and then he would just smile, and that's the only way he could talk intelligibly, because if he tried to release his teeth and talk like this, you couldn't understand him anymore, because he couldn't move all of the pieces independently together. And I've seen this with, there was a girl I knew that had a pretty severe tongue tie, and she was like in her 20s, and so she had taught herself to talk, but she would only open her mouth this much. So anytime she talked to you, she was talking like this, with her lips very close together, because she had to keep, her tongue was tethered to the bottom of her mouth, and just the tip was just barely able to elevate. So the way she articulated, she had to keep her jaw and her palate really close together so that her tongue could hit the top of her palate to make the sounds. Because if she tried to open like this and talk, her tongue was only going to make it like, this far. Anyway, so she had her own version of fixing. If that makes sense. So if we have these symptoms of like, we don't have dissociation, so that's the big one. Like, if my arm couldn't even leave the side of my body to get to the cup, like, we have a problem. My compensation is going to be like, transitioning into talking about like the oral motor deficits, the compensation, like what would my compensation be? I'd probably be going like this. I'd have to find a different way to get to that cup, right? Or if I could do this, but I don't have the grading, it's like, well, I guess I'm getting a straw. I don't know, a really long one, I don't know. So yeah, the oromyofunctional disorders are the compensations that are coming because of these other issues that a lot of times we're born with, or sometimes we acquire if something happens to our brains.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So vidalu he kalmi mi masal ta dimawa mi essababaki ekujaki ufedumuga masalen hurumge sababonge to misalaka ufedumuga ekujage angage paike mi misaka varu hunnanje he varu terai misalaka maseke nukurani me harke nukuraveni ehege sababon dimave daan masal ta ke den vidalu he misaka egota weakness en hunnanya den komes kotaka ඒදී ඇඩොප්ට් කරන්නේ ගොතෙන් හොදාන දෙතෝ එහෙන් වි මදෙන් මිහාරකය කරණි ගෝස්කෝ මිසක හෆායරස් ගෝස්කෝ දෙන් උනුනි වාහක දකරස් ඒ විදාලු මිසක අංගවර කුඩකොග්ගෙන් නුනි ඒ දත්ත ජස්සෙන් කල්ගොයි ගොත ෆෙන්නාන වරගින කුදින් වාහක දකරන දෙන් හාසකෝ විදාලු මිසක වරගින වරගින ෆරාමයි කි කාලා සින්ඩ්‍රෝම්ස් තකුගා විදාලු හේ නුනි මිස ඔටිසම් කොදින්ගේ mi nuni ka cerebral palsy kodinge mi amko mastawge waru dera baane inge to den ekalas mi hunnane masta haru kame ya dit kon harakatake nukureven ehvima waragina far fennani mi kal masta ta hasako wahaka dakkairwa kairuge mi fennani mi masa hunna masata de idale misalaka kaiche jesies normal kolgon me vejam hindulum ani kollevende to dulum misaka e kaiche साफ कोल्ले एकम कुमुली मूण एक्को गेंदाने එහෙම එකහලා මසල්ලේගේ හොරුම්ගේ සාපොනේ අනේ සබබකි මේ ලීසා විදාලු එහෙන් මේ ගෙන්ගොලෙවේ ගොතක මේ කන්තත කරවේ ගොතක මිසලක වයිෆාරු කාන්දේ ඉරුකසේ විදාලු එහෙන් මිසක ෆෙන්නාන වර බොඩුවන් දෙම්වස් වරගින ෆෙනේ මුගුරාෆ කාන්දේනේ මේ කාන්දේ ඉරුග අංගයන් අලානි කුජ්ජාගේ වෙස් ka efforta kanula kujjanu jene bes kahal masekate kuraka angeko den ham osawarka diruwani detto ekamako egota gina duasima mi wagot ke kal ofeden je hunarta ke bhore angage masta baru jehen ebaje harka kuran dasko de beden je ehma e wagutta midani mi ege sababu mi kahal masata mitima misaka mi samsa jassalim saka ossalumge badalga jassalim kujja amilleya samsalun nagafa etikolo kala nunamat mi eki kahala tafatu wattarge misaka hafanje he burikolanje he mi murane chihi nuni chaskon honne chihi tafatu ande to hafan nagaga gengol control kuram ves tafatu an hafanje he go ves tafatu an mi ekala mi eki kahala chi mi try no koddeve kama vanya mi mi denne mehem mi mastawge baaru eba kudave haraka kuranje wara haraka nu korave den misalakan hore dane sihi masal enge to misalaka itoru mi misaka dulugena aru korowon noni tumfatuge misaka innan fahatuge naru mi hunna jeya warabari koru mi hare kala kame rangal no kurevi nuni misalaka arne adenoids kahala mi misaka operation kuran jehe kame rangal no kurevi egina duas wima ekal kudin genna gina fennani angane wala taneva nefatun lomge badalge nefe minani pedifa detto angane walani ehemi mi ekala kame gina duas ve nunika mi rangalu nukurevumge sababun hama mi kal masal tadimawa dan ekala hama haraka kura mi unda guwani detto misaka dulge naaru kuruko mi rangalu nukurevi gina duas vima den mi wargina far rangalu kurias emme kashigen wawara nukureve tan e baade uni wargina fennane ingili hasako bodwa ingili boko din wara bodeti wande poiruga hama ekkala mihin obi kos arne matige mi harutali fumve fainnane dattan e bahure mihin beranni come fa botive gota den by far de ingili boko din sti bene nuni tum waragina dos wara bodeti wande boko din tum nei mi den kuri mi denne vihen para bodeti wandem ves mugurafa para himunko kande kudin ekahala mi vidal vehem wara bavar sabab taken eba himene misa ekkamaki ufedunga masalen hore dane anikkamaki mi kahala kame mi eka mi rangalak kodden jehe kame misaga mi nuumge sababun ekala kamaka devi dane ge to hema komme kamaka hore sangage masalta timave dane.
Yeah, so to build on that, so these oromotor deficits, then what comes from that? The compensations. Mm-hmm. So the oromyofunctional disorders develop. So you might start to see some habitual behaviors. Mm-hmm. So thumb sucking, mm-hmm. or like a kid that will not give up a pacifier mm-hmm. after they're one. They just can't do it. Or same with like a bottle, like yes. They won't get off the bottle. Which all of those things like thumb sucking, pacifiers, bottles, we should start eliminating those. The goal is like by 12 months, but definitely like no later than like 15, 18 months. Like they need to be gone pretty quickly. Because like I'll just do my little soapbox about this really quick. So thumb sucking, the pacifiers, the bottles, it's going like between their teeth, right? And their tongue is like sucking on these things. Mm-hmm. So as their teeth are coming in, we don't want their tongue to be continuing in that pattern, because what does that do? The tongue is really powerful, right? And so if it's going like this against the teeth, it's going to push the teeth out. And so a lot of times you might see kids with something called like an open bite. Mm-hmm. So like even though their molars are together, their teeth are out and there's a hole in their teeth, even with their jaw clenched together. And that's from that pattern. So that's why we want it gone. We want those habits gone like around.
And even there is that depression in the palate also. Yes, because they keep on pressing the thumb. Especially in thumb suckers, we have seen.
Yeah, it keeps your palate. It shapes your palate, right? Yeah, because I'll back up like 2 steps and talk about like, so when we're all born, our palates are like this, like they're very high and narrow, and they're supposed to be, because we want the head to be as narrow as possible when kids are born. Mm-hmm. But what happens, your tongue is supposed to rest up in the palate, and so your tongue is going to shape your palate. So at rest, your mouth should be closed with your teeth slightly apart, not clenched together, slightly apart, and your tongue should be resting in your palate. So if that happens over the course of the first like year to 2 of the child's life, that tongue is going to shape the palate. The palate is going to drop down, and it's going to be wide. Like an ideal palate would be like horseshoe shaped. We want it to be low, nice and wide. And what that's going to do, that's going to create a lot of room in the mouth for all of our teeth. So if this happened for everybody, theoretically, we wouldn't need braces, which that saves some money, right? My parents wish I knew this before, but if that doesn't happen, so, if we have a thumb in our mouth instead of our tongue, or a thumb or a pacifier specifically, the tongue is not in the top of the mouth shaping. there's just a little pacifier or a thumb right here. So not only is it pushing on the palate to shape it to make it like high and more narrow, but the tongue isn't there to help spread the palate out, right? So a lot of things, which those things can be like self-soothing behaviors, like sucking is like it can be typical, but if it's extremely excessive, then it becomes problematic, right? So yes, so some of these habitual behaviors are forming, and also if your kid just will not give up the bottle, which I mean you do have to do some things, like you have to tell them no, and you have to do the whole weaning them off of it. But if that doesn't work, so like I know for some of our children with autism or special needs, it's really, really difficult. But one of the reasons that children love that input so much is there's a spot right behind your front teeth that which your tongue is supposed to be sitting there, right? Like the tip of your tongue is supposed to be hitting that spot right behind your teeth. That spot, when something is touching it, it is releasing a lot of feel-good hormones into the body, like serotonin and endorphins. Like it's a soothing spot, really soothing. And so, but if your tongue, for some reason, whether it's weakness or tongue tie, or there's something going on, if your tongue is not in the top of your mouth and down here, children are going to look for something else to get that sensation. So, so they'll stick a thumb, a pacifier, or even like the bottle, or honestly even breastfeeding, but they're going to put something to soothe that spot, especially like when they go to sleep or they're upset, right? Like it's a self-soothing thing. And so if you have a child that just absolutely like won't get off of those habits, you might look into like, well, is their tongue where it should be? Because the tongue should be performing that function. And the tongue sits behind the teeth, so we don't have to worry about it misshaping the teeth. So the tongue should be doing that job, not the other behaviors. But also something that can happen, we can, like mouth breathing can develop. So, which ENTs specialize in ear, nose, and throat. So if your child is mouth breathing, that's the doctor you want to go see first to kind of look at everything. But if your child's airway is blocked for some reason, they're going to find another way to breathe. So how are we supposed to breathe? I think we all know. Lips closed. Yeah, lips closed through the nose. Especially when we're asleep, right? That's what should be happening. But if you have, so again, it's going to come back to the tongue as one of the that's one of the causes. I'll talk about a few more. So if your tongue is not up in your palate at rest, but it's laying on the floor of your mouth instead, when you go to lay down, that tongue is falling back and it's blocking your airway. And so a child, there's a few different positions they can take. They're going to start distorting their body in different ways to try to get a bigger airway. So they might start, they'll just open their mouth and mouth breathe. They might clench their teeth, because that actually makes the back of your throat wider to get more air. But yeah, a lot of times it just results in mouth breathing. Other problems that come, if you're mouth breathing a lot, we tend to notice that kids' tonsils get a lot bigger, and their adenoids, which are essentially the tonsils of the back of the nose, we can't see them, your ENT can, but those get a lot bigger. So if we're mouth breathing, basically you're losing all of the filtration you have in your nose that blocks out all the allergens and things like that, and so your adenoid tissue and your tonsils are going to get bigger, which is going to further, it's like having two big rocks in the back of your airway. So it makes it even harder. Which is also going to lead to sleep problems, because you need to be breathing well to sleep. If you're not getting enough air, anytime your body falls into deep sleep, it's going to wake itself up, because it's not getting enough oxygen to just run on autopilot, which is a whole other thing. But so breathing's a big problem. It also could just be something as simple as, like, if you just have allergies, to start with. Let's say like your tongue is perfect and beautiful, but you bring your baby home from the hospital and they have allergies. They're allergic to the cat or something. If this is clogged, then they're going to open their mouth to breathe, which means their tongue is going to be on the floor of their mouth instead of the top. So then you can develop some of these compensations, and it was just from having allergies to an oral myofunctional disorder. I've talked about this a little bit, but so we've talked about the habitual behaviors, the mouth breathing that can develop, but there's also structural anomalies. So the most common one is tongue tie, which we'll talk about more in detail in a second, but the tongue tie keeps the tongue on the bottom of the mouth, and all the things we've talked about happen, right? Like if your tongue's tethered to the bottom of your mouth, your tongue can't be in the palate where it belongs. And so it just starts like a whole array of compensations. So especially for like not just sleep, like it's probably definitely going to affect your sleep, but it's also going to affect feeding and speaking a lot of the times, because you just don't have, you've got this compensation because you don't have the range of motion. Like that's the example of like the arm being stuck to the side of my body. It's like, what do I do? You know? Yeah. So.
ಕುಡ ಕುಡ ಬ್ರೇಕ್ ಅಕಫ ಬದ್ದಲು ಕೊಲ್ಲಾಣ Programma marhaba. شو ادم ليزا كياده وفي اگاگ بمسألة الدماغ ما قالوا سبب تدتا اگاگ مسألة الدماغ ندينو كوريدانه كمن onnanita
මෙයාරෝ දෙගොතක ෂෙදෙතෝ විදාලුවේ මේ ඉසක එකමකි උෆෙදුමුග හොරෙතාණියේ ඈබෙන් හොරුම්ගේ සපපොන් නොනි මස්ත පරදෙරවේ කල්කමගේ සපපොනේ අනිකමකි මේ ඔළුමුග ගෙන්ගොල ගොතකුන් නොනි ඒ දෙගොතකු වේදාන දිමා වේදානේ දෙතෝ මිසල්ක මේ උෆෙදුමුග ඒ කහල මස්සලේ පියනෝදේ හොර විදාන කන්තතෝගේ තෙරේග हम वर मुहिम कमिसा कुजागे मियागे मस्त थाया तंता उफेदेनी फुरतमा ट्राइमेस्टागा उफेदेने माबंडो आयल माबंड दस कोलगा देंगे हेमीमा मी नगंजे है मी एकी कहाला एबुरदे तो बेस तके वर मुहिमो मी विटामिन्स तका एची मई रंगल पेनु कोरों गावादों देखो रंगल खाना पेनु कोरों ए दोस्ता का वर मुहिमो आन में सिकोंडिया एगोता हम मूनु के बैता उफेदे मुंदाने ए दुअस कोलोगा ये तो देंगे हेमीमा ए वर बालंजे है दोस्ता के ए वर मुहिमो कामे तेंगानी कमकी मी ए दालो हेमिसागा मी कुडाइरुम फेशिगें एक मी खांदे रुपस खांदे फशाइल गवस मी आगे आगे मस्त बोड़ा बेनो कुरान कहाले कलालगन मी देने भी हैं कुछ मुगुराफ वरदिया को आगे इंगेलुमगे फसे हदेतो कांदे आदमी हारो हुन्नाने फुलीगा अटैच कोफ़ा हुन्नाने समसाला वरगिना पेलेने वेरिंग फेन्नाने तिबेन वर फसे हवान फी तालीम समसलंगेलेन दें हम खांदे वर फसे हवान कुछ जायवस एफर्ट लाकनु जहन ते हम बावाफा एगो तक खांदे ने वरगिना फेन्नाने बावें खांदे ता ये असलुगा खांदे बैंदा पोस्ट जाए की शीन देगें तो हेमीमा ए वर मुहिम कमे तें एगे बदलगा मी देने भी हैं एगो तंग एलुमगे बदलगा कुजाया समसलुन्नागा मी अंगे जस्सालीमा कैरी पुराणे वर कुतुत्तीरुगवस हमसे मस्वारुगस कैरी पुराणे दस को दें ट्राई को दें जहेने दें अतंग इची दिनों वर मुहिम की कहाला टेक्स्ट जगे इची कांगे आगे की कहाला स्किल ता डेवलप को दिनों की वर मुहिम कमे तें हम एगो तब बोयरुस अबदु वर गिने फेन्नाने मिहिं ओस्सालानी गिने समसलुं फें ओस्सालानी नूने कलमी हुन्ननी सीपी कप एचिहिं ओस्सालानी के बदलगा बोडवा वरका मी हुन्ना हमा मी बेनु कुरा कहाला थाशिं हम मिहिं जस्सीमा बोलंदस को दे माने बाइक वर बड़ते वायरस को दिंगे बतीबे मी हुन्ना रेगुलर ताशिं बोनेंगे इंटरवल फेम फुली नूनी फेम बोनेंगे को दिंगे बतीबे එහෙම එකල නූනි බයි කුදින හොලින් බොන්වස් එංගේ කුදින් එබ තිබේ එහෙම එකල් ගන්තත කොද්දින්ම කිවර මුහිම්මුකම දෙන් දෙමේ විදාලේ මිසල්ක මේ එකුජාකි අබදු නේෆෙබ්බේති අබදු රෝගා ජෙහි නේෆෙබ්බේ දිෆහුන්න ඥානුනි අබදු ටොන්සිල් ඇඩනොයිඩ්ස් කාල් මසල් ජෙහෙකම වඤ්ඤාය ෆර්වා කුරුම් වර මුහිම්මු එකල් ගන්තත ෆර්වා නුකුර විදි ගුලාගෙන් දියාම දෙන් එබ දිමාවේ මිකාල් මසල් තාංගයාගේ ඒ හරකයක් කුරන් ජෙවර එකල මිදෙන්න විහින් නුකුරවේ කම වඤ්ඤා මිකාල් මසල් තමි දිමාවනි එදෙන් මි මිසල් කදුල්ගෙන ආරු කුරවේ කල්කම හුරිකමුක වණම්සිය බේනවා ෆර්වා හොදමකි වර මුහිම්මු කමකේ තේම මි කාල්කන්තත කුරීම මි මිසල්කේ කුජ්ජාකි උෆේ දුමු ගබස් අගයාගේ මසලෙන් හුරි නෝනි වරු තෙර නෝනි හර කැන්නු කරවේ කාල් කුජෙවස් ඒ මසලත කුඩ කුරවිගෙන් එබදේ මිගොත මසිකේ කොද්දේ කම වඤානිකමකි මි කාල් මසලේ මුමුන් එබසලාමේ කොද්දවේ මිසක් කුරි දුරාලා मी सिही फरवाए नगन जेहे कहला कमिंग हो रही है कमा फरवा देवीगे
कुरीग सुवालಕ್ಕೆ ಜವಾಬ್ ವಿದಾಳುದೆ ತೊ ತುಂಬೇನು ಕುರಾವಾಹಕ
ಆದೆ
ಬಿಹಾರ್ ಹುರೆದ ತೊ ಗೆಲ್ಲುನ್ನುವ ಗೊತಂ ಹುನ್ನ ತುಂ ಎಚ್ಸ್ ಬೇನು ಕುರುಡಾಗಳತು
ಆದೆ ಮಿಹಾರ್ ವರ ಫೆನೆದೆ ತೊ ಬೈ ಫಾರ್ ಬೆಲೆನ್ ವೆರಿಂ ಬೋನಾನೆ ತಿಮಣ್ಣಗೆ ದರಿಫುಳು ಬೇನು ಕುರನೆ ಕಲ ಗೆಲ್ಲುನ್ನುವ ಗೊತಂ ಹುನ್ನ ආස වකිතුම් හුරේ යරෙහෙන් ලියෆ හුන්නානේ තුම්ගේ බේරුගමි තුමකි දත්තක අනේ ගෙල්ගොන්නුවානේ ඒකෝතම් හුන්න තුම් හුරේ දත්තම හැරකි කහල බ්‍රෑන්ඩ් එකි බ්‍රෑන්ඩ් තකෝගේ හුරේ දැන් තෙද මි ආදාගේ මි හුන්න තුම වරන් එතොන්ඩා ගාලු ගෙතෝ ඒග හුන්නානි බල්ලවාලේ වෙස් තෆාතු වානේ තුන් ඉන්න ගොයි ඉන්නතන් කොල ෆිත්තාෆ මි ආදාගේ තුන් ඉන්නන් මි බොඩුකෝ tetto en bodu kon inima ekal demme vidalu hen kayyan eba ane press wede to be ba dengani kaduluge haraka kuranje waran haraka tennu korave e avret miti innani tafatu ko fitta fa innani detto ehem wima me aadage tumakavure misalaka denje hijiya mitun nangalu kama baur dirasa tan hurenge to ekama korei fehema alaki ayruga ordinary tumakavure ඒ ඕතෝඩොන්ටික් සූතාසය කියන්නේ ඒ චිහිරංගලේ එකමකු එවස් දිගුමුද්දතක බේනුකුරු නගලේ නොනේ කොම ගොත එවස් ඉතුරු එච්චද තෝ යංගයාගේ ඉන්න හැමබදු ජහාෆ ඉන්න ඉරුග එකල රීසා විදාලේ හිමිසක අස්තුග දුලුන් එරන් හරකයක් කුරන් ජෙහෙ කන්තතක එනකොල කොම ගොත ඉතුරු එච්චේ බයි ඉඳේ අබදස් අංගයා තෙරේග එමේ ගිනුගේ සබබොන් කොමස් කහලා බා හුරස්තකින් එලේ දත්තෝ එමේ ඒගේ බදල් ගරංගලි එම්මේ රංගලි අහරු වයරු හුට්ටුනියයි නෝනියා දෙන් තෝලෝ අහරු එහවරු වයරුග හුට්ටාල මසෙකේ කුරුම් වර මුහිම්මේ වරබ්බොටති කුදින් ෆෙන්නානේ බේනෝ කුරාතන් දෙම අනේ එකහල මී තුමේ වියස් දිගුමුද්දතක බේනෝ කුරීමේ ගේ බහුරේ හමකෝස් මී ඒ අසල්ත ෆෙනි ෆහෙම මී එම්මේ වී රංගලි එවස් විහා අනේ අවහම් හුට්ටාලොම් දෙන් ආදාගේ තුමකවර එකම ඒති රංගල්
We just mentioned about a case of a tongue tie. What is tongue tie and how does it affect feeding and speaking?
Yeah, so tongue tie, a simple way to explain it is just like your tongue is tethered to the floor of your mouth. Instead of being able to move around, left, right, up, down, there's a piece of tissue that runs under the tongue, your frenulum. And the frenulum attaches there's different levels of tongue tie, but in the worst form, the frenulum would be attached like all the way to the tip. So that when you stick, how you can kind of tell if they have like a really severe tongue tie, when they go to stick their tongue out, because that tissue is tied all the way to the tip of the tongue, they try to stick their tongue out to point it, and their tongue kind of becomes heart-shaped because that tissue is holding the tongue in. So we'll call it like a heart-shaped tongue when they try to stick it out. But that is the worst of the worst kind. There's different levels of it. And there's not just tongue ties, there's also lip and buccal ties that also will restrict like your lip range of motion and like your cheeks. But I think the most important thing to look at with tongue tie, because everybody has a piece of tissue under their tongue, and it's going to look different on everyone. And for some people, what we really want to look at is not just what it looks like underneath the tongue, but what is the tongue able to do. So for me, my tissue runs like 75% of the length of my tongue, but it's very loose, so I can still elevate my tongue, lateralize my tongue about 90% of the way, not 100, but 90, so I can stick my tongue out, elevate, depress. So it's my feet, my speech is not impacted, and I can eat just fine, right? But you could have a child or someone that has it's the same length, like it might look the same if you lifted our tongues up, but it's very tight. Like if you go to try to like lift up their tongue, the highest their tongue can go in their mouth is maybe like halfway. And maybe the tip is free, but that tongue definitely can't move side to side, which it needs to be able to do for eating, to move the food around. And then they're probably going to have trouble elevating. They definitely don't have the range of motion because it's so tight they can only move it halfway. So they're going to do that fixing. They're going to like close their jaw quite a bit to help their tongue reach the top of their mouth, right? But because that tissue is so tight, they're really going to struggle. So we want to look at, like when we have someone come into our clinic and they say, hey, I think I might have a tongue tie, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look. And the proper way to look for a tongue tie, you don't just like open the kid's mouth and try to lift it up and call it good. Because you're not going to get a feel for the amount of tension in the tongue that way. You're going to lay the child's head in your lap with their feet out here, and you have mom and dad or someone helping you. You're going to stick your fingers this way and with gloves on and lift up their tongue. So that way you're going to get a visual on like how long is that band of tissue, and then you're also going to see, you're going to be pulling, so you're going to see how tight is it. Is their tongue just barely lifting off the bottom of their mouth? Is it able to come halfway, or do they have full range of motion? And then I'm gonna watch a child eat, or I'm gonna watch a child speak, and I'm gonna just see what are they doing with their mouth. Are they fixing, like this? Is their tongue just coming out every time? Compensations, basically, like what compensations do I see? Because if that tongue can't go left and right for feeding, a tongue going left and right for feeding is what gets the muscles of the tongue strong enough to elevate. So if a tongue can't lateralize, a tongue can't elevate, and you need to be able to elevate for a proper swallow, but also for a lot of speech sounds, right? So specifically how this can affect feeding. So it can start from day one. If you have a baby born with a tongue tie, it's going to affect their latch and breastfeeding from day one. It happened with my son. My son had a tongue, a lip, and buccal ties. I had the full package, yay me. But it made it very difficult for him to latch. And so, like I talked about on the episode on feeding, so I'll just reference that, but I won't go into too much detail. But breastfeeding is supply and demand. And so if a baby's not able to latch correctly to like make a good demand, the supply is not going to come in. So I've heard a lot of women say like, my milk just didn't come in, and they feel like it's their fault. And the majority of the time, like 90% of the time, it's not you. There was something wrong with your child's latch that just wasn't identified. So yeah, it can make breastfeeding difficult. It can make breastfeeding very painful. After the first couple weeks, like breastfeeding really shouldn't be painful. So it can impair what we call their suck, swallow, breathe ratio. So it should be 1 to 1 to 1. Like babies suck, they swallow, take a breath, do it again. 1, 1, 1. Suck, swallow, breathe, suck, swallow, breathe. But if they're having to compensate because specifically, like if you have a tongue tie, again, a proper swallow it's like a wave with your tongue against the top of your mouth. But if you have a tongue tie, the best most kids are doing with breastfeeding is just they're pumping their tongue, which is okay. If you give them a bottle, they can do that with a bottle, but they're not going to get adequate feeding like from the breast. So what it looks like is it might be suck, 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 swallow, breathe, suck, 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 swallow, breathe. And they wear themselves out. So a lot of times these kids, they can be labeled failure to thrive, which means like they're not gaining weight fast enough. But it's because they're working so hard to eat because their mouth, it just isn't working how it's supposed to. We also see with tongue tie, we see frequent spitting up, which that's normal to a certain extent, right? But if your child is spitting up most of their feed, most of the time when they eat, that's not normal. Even if they're gaining weight like they're supposed to, it's not normal for them to throw back up most of what they just ate every single time. So that's just like that's a big red flag. But also the way your swallow pattern is affected with a tongue tie, because of the compensations of how they're having to swallow, a lot of times they swallow a lot of air, and that also that causes the spitting up. It can also cause a lot of gas.
Yes.
So a lot of times children will get identified as having colic, which colic isn't a diagnosis really. It's a symptom. A colic is a symptom. Usually means they're really fussy and we don't know why.
Yes.
And so sometimes if that's happening, like it's common, and there are a lot of causes for it, but maybe make sure like their latch and everything is fine. Make sure everything's moving through their body normally. But yeah, a lot of times it can be from, like, it starts with feeding problems that affects the rest of the body. Let's see. And then it can even be, you know, these kids, maybe they're okay. They make it through, like, bottle feeding or breastfeeding, but then you go to try to introduce solids, and they start gagging, and they can't do it. And you know why? Because they can't move their tongue side to side. The beautiful window of time for that is 7 to 9 months. Within 7 to 9 months, that tongue going side to side, that skill is developing. But if your tongue is stuck to the bottom of your mouth, that's not going to happen. At least not how it should, right? Their little tongues should be able to go and touch, like almost both of where their molars would be. But if they can't do that, they're going to struggle with solids. They can also have difficulty transitioning off of the bottle to straws and open cups because they're relying on that pumping motion, but you need a more mature like tongue retraction pattern for sipping through a straw or drinking from a cup. But a lot of times also, if you've had an abnormal swallowing pattern, it affects your jaw shape. So you might have like an underbite or an overbite. And so if it's affected your jaw shape, where like your jaw is really far back and then you try to go put in a cup, but your mouth's out here, your top teeth are over here, but your bottom teeth are back here, it makes open cup drinking like really difficult, right? It can also result in highly selective eating, which we would consider around like 20 foods or less. If your child's eating 20 foods or less, you're having to make a special meal for them every time they, which kids have, they're allowed to have some peculiarities, right? Like my son doesn't like tomatoes right now, so that's okay. He doesn't have to eat the tomatoes. But if for the most part, like they only eat very specific things, that can be because there's only certain foods that feel safe to them because they can't control all of they can only control certain kinds of foods because of the limitations of their mouth, caused from their tongue being tethered to the bottom. And then, so we also mentioned tongue ties can affect speech, right? And we talked about you need the tongue, lip, and jaw dissociation to make appropriate speech sounds. So depending on the level of impairment, almost all of the sounds can be impacted by tongue ties. It just depends on the level of impairment. So for some kids, it's, they're mostly speaking in vowels because their tongue is so stuck. It's just vowels coming out. And then there's some kids that they can get a lot of other sounds out, but their S's, their R's, their L's, those are impaired, and they just don't, especially the S's and R's, they just never go away. They can't ever quite get it. And specifically, like for R, you need to be able to completely like retract your tongue. And your tongue is going to touch like the sides of your molars up here. Like so like if your tongue, like you really need the back of your tongue to be able to move. So if the back of your tongue is tethered and you can't pull it up and back, that R is not going to come easily. So
Yeah.
We have tag programmes nimaka ameng ese tomati vara beenun tere vara faida hore maulo mattake alugunu mung beenun tere nalde begendiya kam ummed kora vara bada shukriya de befnaves program wadagenede. Thank you so much for joining with us in this program. We have tag program ves nimmala favaki velana anna haftaage ves hasse hiyen ehiye me program ga mulinga program ka ekiga baddalolum ga ummed ga vaki velana. Wassalamu alaikum.